Picture this: 10 million years ago, deep in a forest, long before anything you'd call human existed, there's a primate wandering through the trees, and on the ground beneath those trees, fruit is rotting, fallen, bruised, sun-baked, fermenting fruit. And inside that fruit, something is happening chemically. Sugars are breaking down into ethanol, alcohol. Nature making it all on its own, with no human hand involved. And this, weirdly enough, is where one of the strangest and least told stories in human history actually begins. Because we didn't invent alcohol. Alcohol found us, long before we ever thought to make it ourselves. Here's how it works. Fruit drops from a tree, sits on the forest floor, wild yeasts break down the sugar inside it, and out comes carbon dioxide and ethanol as a byproduct. This chemical reaction has been happening for millions of years, long before our species showed up. And the primates living in those forests were eating that fermented fruit constantly, not because they were looking for a buzz, but because it was food, because they were hungry, because it was right there on the ground. But at some point, something got noticed. Eating that fruit made them feel a little different, a little looser, a little less on edge, a little better. Biologist Robert Dudley picked up on this years ago and gave it a name: the drunken monkey hypothesis. His argument goes like this: the human body's ability to process alcohol is not an accident. We carry an enzyme called ADH4 in our liver, and a particular version of that enzyme, one that's dramatically better at breaking down ethanol, appears to have evolved right around the time our ancestors came down from the trees and started eating fallen fruit off the ground. That's roughly 10 million years ago. In other words, we didn't develop the ability to handle alcohol for fun, we developed it to survive. Individuals who could find fermenting fruit and safely eat it were getting extra calories, avoiding starvation, staying alive longer than the ones who couldn't. Getting a little tipsy might not have been the point, but being able to handle it certainly was an advantage. Now let's jump forward, a long way forward, hundreds of thousands of years. Homo sapiens shows up, starts living in groups, develops language, learns to control fire, and at some point, we genuinely don't know exactly when, humans stop encountering fermentation by accident and start making it happen on purpose. Honey mixed with water ferments almost on its own, producing what we now call mead, and some researchers think this might have been the very first alcoholic drink humans deliberately created. Honey was everywhere, it was easy to ferment, and the result packed a real punch. But the strongest physical evidence we actually have comes from somewhere very specific: China. At a site called Jiahu, along the Yellow River, archaeologists found pottery shards dating back roughly 9,000 years, and chemical analysis of the residue revealed traces of rice, honey, and fruit, all consistent with a fermented beverage. 9,000 years. That's before the invention of the wheel, before writing, arguably before most forms of agriculture had even spread widely. Which raises an odd possibility. Humans may have figured out how to brew alcohol before they reliably figured out how to bake bread. Some archaeologists take this even further, arguing that agriculture itself may not have started because of bread at all. This is sometimes called the beer before bread hypothesis, and it's taken seriously enough to be debated in real academic circles. The idea is this: humans may have domesticated wheat and barley, not primarily to make bread, but to produce fermentable grain, maybe even mostly for that reason. At Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists found massive stone vessels, sized in a way that matches wheat and barley fermentation, sitting inside what looks like a temple complex used for large communal gatherings. We know groups came together there for ritual purposes, so it's entirely plausible that thousands of years ago, nomadic hunter-gatherer groups, who otherwise had no reason to stay in one place, gathered specifically to drink beer together, camped out temporarily, and then dispersed again. And if that kept happening, over and over, those temporary gatherings could have slowly hardened into permanent settlements. If that's true, then civilization may not have started with a field. It may have started with a cup. Let's talk about the Sumerians, because they were not subtle about any of this. Sumerian mythology has an entire goddess dedicated to beer, Ninkasi. There's a hymn written in her honor, dating back about 4,000 years, and this hymn is, quite literally, a smuggled beer recipe. Line by line, it walks through preparing malt, baking bread specifically to be crumbled into the brew, letting it ferment, straining the liquid, an actual production process disguised as poetry. The Sumerians didn't just treat beer as sacred, they encoded the recipe into a religious hymn so it would be memorized and passed down across generations. That's how important beer was to them. It wasn't a luxury, it was closer to a basic necessity, so essential that workers were sometimes paid in it. The laborers who built the pyramids in Egypt, contrary to the old myth that they were enslaved, were paid workers, and part of their compensation came in the form of beer. We're talking several liters a day in some accounts, though that era's beer was far weaker than what we drink now. More of a nutritional staple than an intoxicant, rich in calories and B vitamins, and importantly, a much safer option than drinking water in places where water wasn't reliably clean. And that's actually one of the most overlooked details in this whole story. Water was not always safe. Contaminated water was a constant source of disease across the ancient world, but fermented drinks, thanks to alcohol's natural antimicrobial properties, were frequently safer to drink than water itself. So for thousands of years, across huge stretches of human history, people drank beer or wine not purely for pleasure, but because it was, quite literally, a healthier substitute for water. By the time you get to medieval Europe, this had turned into something close to a way of life. Small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew, was consumed by entire families, children included, as a daily staple alongside meals, largely because it was safer than the local water supply and provided real caloric value. Monasteries became some of the most important brewing centers in Europe, not out of indulgence, but out of necessity. Monks needed something reliable to drink and something to offer travelers, and beer fit both needs. Some monastic breweries from that era are still operating today, centuries later, using methods that trace directly back to those origins. Wine took a different cultural path. In the Mediterranean world, particularly in Greece and Rome, wine wasn't just a drink, it carried religious and philosophical weight. The Greek god Dionysus wasn't simply the god of wine, he represented ecstasy, loss of control, the dissolving of ordinary boundaries between people. Wine at Greek symposiums was mixed with water and treated as something almost sacred, and drinking it undiluted was considered a sign of barbarism, not sophistication. The Romans expanded viticulture across their entire empire, and in doing so, permanently reshaped the agricultural landscape of Europe. Vineyards planted 2,000 years ago in France, Spain, and Italy are in many cases still standing on the same land today. Distillation changes the story again, and this part is genuinely surprising to most people. Distilled spirits, the strong stuff, whiskey, brandy, vodka, are actually a relatively recent development compared to beer and wine. The technique for distilling alcohol likely originated with alchemists in the Islamic world and medieval Europe, initially developed not to get people drunk faster, but for medicine and chemistry. The word alcohol itself comes from Arabic, tracing back to al-kul, originally referring to a fine powder used in cosmetics, later applied to any refined distilled substance. For centuries, distilled spirits were treated as medicine, prescribed by physicians for pain, for fevers, for practically anything. It took a while before people fully embraced them as recreational drinks rather than remedies kept in an apothecary's cabinet. What ties this whole story together, from that ancient primate eating rotten fruit off a forest floor, to a Sumerian hymn hiding a beer recipe, to a monk in a medieval abbey brewing the day's ration, is that alcohol was never really about getting drunk. It was about calories, safety, ritual, community, medicine, survival. Getting intoxicated was often just a side effect that people eventually learned to enjoy, and later, to chase deliberately. The instinct itself, the pull toward altering how we feel, whether through fermented fruit, brewed grain, or crushed grapes, appears to run so deep and so far back into our evolutionary history that it may honestly predate the human species itself. So the next time you crack open a beer, pour a glass of wine, or watch someone toast at a wedding, you're not doing something new. You're repeating something your ancestors, and their ancestors before them, going back millions of years, were already doing. Long before anyone wrote it down, long before anyone gave it a name, long before anyone understood why it felt the way it did.